Hi everyone, welcome to this talk on infecting humans for vaccine development one day sooner by Jasmin Kaur. She is a biochemist. She finished her master's in biochemistry at Warwick University, used to work in the pharmaceutical industry, but has now left and is now leading the UK's one day sooner strategy, so the one day sooner strategy in the UK on human challenge trials. She's going to give us a really exciting talk today, so I hope you all have lots of questions, and please ask these questions on the Swap Card app. And with this, let's begin.
Thank you, Dev.
Can we all have a round of applause for her, by the way?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to do this talk because a lot of those stuff that I'll be sharing about things we've been working on is things that have been in a pipeline for the past 2 to 3 years that we've just incubated, and we're excited to launch in the UK. So this is almost like our exclusive first look on the things we're working on. And what I'll be focusing on is our strategy in the UK, how the evolution of human challenge studies has been over time, and how it's really this innovative tool we could be utilizing when we think about solutions to future outbreaks. Before I jump into the presentation, I just wanted to do sort of a quick background to kind of things that have been at the forefront of my mind when thinking about solutions to this, which kind of help add context into how these solutions exist and hence why they exist. So as Dave was mentioning, my focus right now is leading our implementation strategy in the UK, which is looking at how does the UK government adopt the recommendations we put forward for how we utilize challenge studies for pandemic preparedness. But before I got into the policy world, so to speak, there we go. Before I got into the policy world, my background by training is a biochemist. So I trained in academic research and spent some of my time working on projects in genetics and developmental biology. I love the science. I realized I hated being in the lab, guilty admission, and therefore I wanted to try something different. And I tried doing biopharmaceutical science. So a lot of my work at the time was focused on utilizing AI pipelines for how we do cell triaging that eventually helped make a lot of the pharmaceutical interventions. Again, loved the science, but again, didn't enjoy working in the lab, even if it was a pharmaceutical context. And then sort of in the past year or two, I kind of got involved with this bunch of people call this EA thing, and that was my sort of intro into the world of biosecurity and kind of thinking about longer term future. And I decided to work in an organization and a project that was working on the intersection of biosecurity and advocacy. And a lot of the work I'm doing right now is really like a cocktail infusion for a lot of the things that I've been working on, have been thinking about. So we at One Day Sooner, we started in April 2020, really at this sort of peak COVID outbreak phase. And a lot of the times when we think about how clinical studies are designed and talked about in the media or the outside world, the focus always tends to be on the organizations or pharmaceutical companies that are designing the vaccines or working on the solutions, but never really enough on brave volunteers who decide to come forward, participate in these trials, and become infected, all because they want to help advance science, which I think is a super brave thing to do. So in 2020, when the UK government decided opening conversations about doing challenge studies, we really wanted to be the voice that was at the forefront, representing the voices of these participants and making sure, everything from informed consent to the right compensation to the right ethics review was being done right by these volunteers. So that's kind of our roots, so to speak. And since then, we've branched into a lot of the solutions from sort of indoor air safety stuff that some of our team is working on, and also more about thinking about future pandemic preparedness. And since the intro is sort of out of the way, what the rest of the talk will focus on, I'll start with an intro to what clinical development and human challenge studies actually are, what their significance is, and how do they exactly help expedite our ability to make vaccines. I'll then touch on what was the significance for the UK to conduct the world's first COVID-19 challenge study, and what does that mean for the rest of the world. And then we'll end with a note on, if people are interested to get involved, what those next steps could be look like. When I was thinking about how to explain what challenge studies actually are, I really wanted to take my bias out of the equation. So I was like, how do I come up with a definition that's like brief, to the point, and concise? And since like all the cool kids are now using ChatGPT, I was like, maybe I should also do that. So I decided to like give it a prompt. I was like, help me come up with like a cool and a brief definition for what challenge studies are. And it decided to come up with this, which is like, ever wondered what it'd be like if speed dating and vaccine development had a baby? And yeah, I was not so impressed. And after reading that, like my first reaction was to go into like our group WhatsApp chat at like midnight and be like, I think I need mouthwash, but like for my eyes after seeing that. So that didn't work. So I was like, okay, we should like take a step back and really think about what are clinical development studies from scratch before we even touch what human studies are. So some of you might already be familiar with this framework, which is what does the stages of clinical development usually look like. But I'll touch very briefly on this. So before you start clinical development, you have the preclinical studies, and this is where a lot of the early discovery and research about potential vaccine candidate is conducted. This is also the phase where you utilize animal models to test these vaccine candidates. And if the safety and the efficacy looks promising, you move on to phase 1, where you have between 20 to 100 people that you recruit for the study. This is usually quite small scale, and again, you test for the safety and dosage requirements for a vaccine. Again, if the results look promising, you progress into phase 2, which is a slightly bigger sample of 100 to 300 people. And usually this is a stage where you also recruit a more diverse group of people. For example, since you are working with bigger numbers, you might recruit older adults for a study or children, depending who the vaccine is being designed for. And again, if the dosage, the efficacy, and the safety looks good, you move on to kind of the behemoth of all of these stages, which is phase 3. And phase 3 is where you need between 1,000 to 30,000 people for the study. Sometimes it can be even more than that. And this is one of the most complicated infrastructure time, scientific technology times, and also kind of the time compensation that is required to do phase 3. And usually this is the stage where sometimes a lot of the side effects that individuals might have to the vaccine or therapeutic might also come forward, because you are just working with such a larger data set that a lot of those rare side effects start to emerge. And again, if the safety and efficacy is acceptable and vaccine seems pretty good at targeting the disease or pathogen that you want to avoid, phase 4 is where you seek authorization from bodies like the FDA in the US or EMA in Europe. And if everything looks good again, the vaccine in phase 4 is now officially on the market and ready for manufacturing and mass distribution. Important thing to note for this is one of the reasons it's really important we get it right in terms of which vaccine candidates we're taking across the stage is I mentioned some of the factors like time, the amount of people required for conducting these studies, the amount of infrastructure. But these studies are also like super expensive, and they get progressively sort of more expensive as you go from phase 1 to 4. So phase 1 study roughly sits around 1.5 million, and it can go up to 10 million. And phase 2 is somewhere between the 10 to 50 million mark, and then phase 3 can go all the way up to 500 million or sometimes even more than that. And it's worth noting that as you enter phase 4, this is kind of like the job is not over yet. Once a vaccine is out in the market, you're likely to continue monitoring it over its life cycle to see what kind of response people are having now that it's out in the wider population across the world, and if the formulation needs to be updated at any point. So we've just realized what a traditional clinical development model looks like when it comes to vaccines. So what are human infection studies? So human infection studies are where healthy volunteers, usually between the ages of 18 to 29, decide to put themselves forward to be voluntarily infected with a particular pathogen in order to gather the data points. And the point of doing this is it allows us to understand a lot about the disease in its early stages, which is really imperative data for how we design vaccines and solutions for the disease that we want to focus on. And in this model that I just showed you, human challenge studies would usually sit somewhere between the phase 2 and the phase 3. When you look at this, I think a question that often comes to mind is, I've just mentioned like how kind of time consuming and expensive it is to do vaccine trials, and introducing additional stage in between these phases just seems like a really silly step in theory. So like, what is the point of introducing this, and how exactly does it help expedite some of the solutions? So a really important point to first test on is that when you do field clinical studies, if you look at a phase 3 clinical study, you would administer a vaccine to about, let's say, 20,000 people, and then you kind of let them go about their daily life until they become infected in the wild naturally. And this is a very time-consuming process, because sometimes a lot of the people just would never catch the virus that you're trying to understand better, or sometimes some people just don't develop any symptoms, so they won't even know they're infected, or sometimes when people show up with symptoms, it's at a very late stage of the disease, so you completely missed out on these early data points that you really want to understand. So, but doing a study in a controlled environment where you are the individual or the scientist, a group of people infecting these volunteers, you're able to monitor that from day one and really able to understand how does your immune system respond to the pathogen. And this kind of meshes into the point 2 that I wanted to mention, is it really helps solve this sort of early black box of disease modeling, because you don't have to do any guessing work for when a person became infected with a certain pathogen. You know exactly the time, the date, the place when an individual was infected. So literally from like second 1, you're able to monitor what the immune response looks like and what sort of markers your body is producing. This point is already kind of touched on. So because you can do a control group and a vaccine group and compare the results directly, you need a much smaller sample size than you usually would. So human challenge studies usually involve something like less than 100 participants, and compare that to something in phase 2 and phase 3, which requires thousands and thousands of people. The last 2 points I'll kind of combine there is, I mentioned that it's really important that given the limited time we have in something like a pandemic scenario, we're not sort of wasting time testing candidates which don't seem so promising. So we really need a method that helps you filter through the data and decide the most promising intervention that you want to carry forward for results, for gathering more data. And human challenge studies is a really good way to gather that and make that decision in a very time-consuming situation. This slide is really just an example for kind of the wins we've had when it comes to challenge studies. So a lot of the time when I bring up the concept of deliberately infecting people in the name of science, there's this idea that challenge studies are this sort of like new controversial idea on the market that we don't really understand, which is a little bit of a misconception, because challenge studies have been around since like early 1940s in the UK, and we've been using them for influenza vaccines. And this is like a very brief list of some of the major like wins we've had when it comes to developing vaccines that directly use human challenge studies. So influenza vaccine, as I mentioned, we've been doing this for decades and decades, and now there are some more vaccines out there on the market. Typhoid vaccines, we developed an injectable vaccine as a direct result of human challenge studies. Malaria studies, vaccines have sort of been in the news quite a lot recently, because when they were first approved in 2015, and then the World Health Organization in 2021 recommended that these malaria vaccines in particular for children in sort of sub-Saharan African region. So it really was like a big win for science and ability to make vaccines. So a norovirus vaccine is something that is still ongoing. I have not to date seen an approved vaccine on the market, but the ongoing trials are all utilizing human challenge studies. And we had a big win with our ability to make a vaccine for cholera for a lot of endemic settings, which was super, super important for how we do global health. We just talked about sort of what challenge studies are and the use cases for challenge studies. I briefly want to touch on UK's decision to do challenge studies and why they were so imperative. So around May 2020, World Health Organization decided to approve a framework saying that we are all good to do challenge studies for testing vaccines. And following that, Imperial College London in 2021 became the first place ever to do world's first COVID-19 challenge studies. And one of the reasons this really marks like a new turning page for us in history is because before this, they were only ever utilized for sort of endemic disease settings. But this time we were doing this in real-time response situation where we're utilizing them from pandemics, which is kind of a game changer how we think about, what are the solutions we have when it comes to preparing for future outbreaks. This study, which was initiated in 2021, was then closely followed by University of Oxford, which also started another study to study reinfection in volunteers. And some of the key sort of metrics that we hit as a result of conducting this was we were really able to test the accuracy for a lot of diagnostics we're using at the time, like lateral flow tests, how accurate they were, how could they be improved better. We were also able to study like what is the minimum dose of COVID-19 you need in order to have symptoms and also pass it on to other people. So this was really important data point for studying and understanding transmission. And the last thing that was a key finding was what is the incubation period for the virus, which, as we now know, is super important for understanding everything from quarantine rules, diagnostics, to what the therapeutics itself look like. And before we started this challenge study, I think a lot of the views were that incubation period was something that sat above a week, and the minimum dose was almost double what we thought it was. But as a result of the study, we found actually, like in day 2, people start showing symptoms in their upper respiratory tract for having COVID-19, which is not something you could ever sort of measure if you didn't know exactly the time and date when someone became infected, hence challenge studies. And just a quick touch on sort of the on-the-ground work that we were doing as an organization during the COVID pandemic is, so we really wanted to make sure that we had a very diverse and good group of participants to participate in the 2021 study. So we did a lot of on-the-ground recruitment. And as a result, we now have 40,000 people across the world in our database who have signed up to do challenge studies. And these are the really brave individuals that we get to host and represent. This one in particular is 3 members who are all part of our core team who took part in the COVID-19 challenge studies. It's almost trying to lead by example with the work we do. And as a result, we wanted to put forward the stories of these individuals, the bravery they had, and really highlight these voices instead of just talking about pharma companies and the things that media usually does. And we were lucky that major news outlets like The Guardian, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times were willing to pick up and share these stories across the world, which is just really beautiful to see. This kind of touches on some of the things that we'll continue to do this year to really appreciate the work that these volunteers are putting forward to help advance scientific commitment. We're hosting COVID-19 appreciation events. We haven't found a more catchy name yet. We're working on it. But the point is that we'll gather a lot of the scientists who work on the COVID response and the volunteers and really help show appreciation for kind of the altruism they hold to help do this for the people around the world and help develop vaccines when required. And this is just 2 snapshots I really like because they're just adorable from some of our volunteer gatherings that we did in the UK. And I think we also did a EAGxCambridge talk at some point, and that's the group there. Kind of jumping on what challenge studies are and what their future holds. I've just gone on and on about how good they are and how useful they can be for medical interventions, but there's still a lot of bottlenecks that we haven't resolved. If we think back to the 2021 study, so the World Health Organization approved the entire framework in 2020 at the sort of the earlier stages of the pandemic. It still took us almost a year to start the first COVID-19 infection study. And as we know, time in a pandemic is a ticking time bomb. So it's really important, we're questioning about how can we do this better and how can we do this at a stage where the data that comes off challenge studies can actually be useful for a lot of the ongoing interventions. So some of the reasons why it takes such a long time to set up these studies for challenge studies is the production of the GMP standard agent. In non-fancier terms, what it really means is if you want to infect individuals for a virus that you're interested to study, you need to first actually manufacture that virus. And manufacturing that virus to a good manufacturing practice, which is something that biotech or pharma company uses as like a standard operating procedure, is a really tricky process because not only do you need to make it safe, I understand the irony here, but also quality control that sample and also make sure that it is consistent for every batch of the challenge agent that you're producing, which is like absolutely not an easy thing to achieve, especially in a really early pandemic scenario when you understand very little about a pathogen that's out there infecting people. Another really important thing to understand here is we talk about the stories of these brave volunteers coming forward to get infected, but any of this cannot be a compromise on patient safety, which is every person's duty who's part of the decision-making process, the approval process. So really understanding about how do we balance and prioritize that in a case where we also understand very little about the pathogen that we're testing. And third and fourth there is kind of follows on my second point, which is that there's a lot of ethical decisions to navigate in a scenario like this, such as when does the cost-benefit ratio make sense? You cannot just play a numbers game. It's important that you're taking every input into your decision-making, and sometimes, getting public's opinion on board is also really important for policymakers who eventually are in charge of approving the decision about whether to do these studies or not. Surprisingly for COVID-19, I think when we started the challenge studies, there were doubts that people might have a reaction to doing something like this, but actually over 50% of the people that were surveyed were in favor of doing challenge studies for COVID-19, which just shows that, where we think our knowledge is far from where the reality stands, and really it is an opportunity to make sure that public is also involved in how we make these decisions in the future. And the last kind of bottleneck here I'll touch on briefly is the infrastructure that's required to conduct these studies. So when you infect these individuals with pathogens, it's really important that their quarantine is well conducted, so they're not putting other members of the population or the scientists in the room at risk. So you need really good biosecure facilities that can host these participants while they're undergoing their infection period, which are expensive to set up, requires a lot of coordination, which is becoming increasingly difficult in this industry for a lot of reasons. So the right infrastructure is also important, but currently a bottleneck that we're trying to solve. And this kind of touches towards the end bit of my presentation, which is I've just talked about what challenge studies are, what the significance is, why they're important, and then what are things that we still need to solve. And then what I guess a lot of my time is focused on these days is how do we solve these bottlenecks, so when we think about the future of these studies for UK and the rest of the world. And in order to solve that, we've been working on this paper for over a year, nearly 2 years, in collaboration with authors from University of Oxford, individuals who were part of the Oxford vaccine group, Imperial College London that did the first challenge study, and contributors from bodies like CEPI to kind of understand about what are all of the risks that we need to navigate when thinking about the future of utilizing challenge studies for pandemic scenarios, and how can we resolve that. This paper will be out on Monday, so it is literally 2 days away. But I will just summarize sort of the 3 broader recommendations that it contains. Recommendation 1 is that we need a very, very clear structure for how to do decision making for COVID, for challenge studies during pandemic scenarios. For this, we have actually put forward almost equivalent of a flowchart for decision making for policymakers so they can make these decisions under time pressure. But again, we don't want this to be something we created in-house and kind of like serve it up on a plate. We really want this to be more of a collaboration between people who are going to be actually doing the work as well. So we want this to be something that we revise and update and improve in collaboration. Recommendation 2 is that we should really help streamline the ethics review process a lot. So one thing that happened during the 2021 studies was the pandemic happened, we all kind of rushed into this firefighting mode, which meant like trying to find the right people to do these studies and trying to find the right individuals who can bring their expertise. But if we had done the work of mapping these out scenarios beforehand and setting up a lot of these ethics committees beforehand, a lot of that time could have been saved, which is something that we really want to push for future scenarios. Recommendation 3 touches on the infrastructure bottleneck that I was talking about, is that we need the right investments and we need the right collaborations across policy, private markets, to make sure that we have the facilities and the technologies to do this well. But you can read about this more in literally 2 days. Last bit that I'll touch on is ways for people to get involved. So anybody within the UK or passing through UK on the 5th of April next month, we're doing a huge launch event, a welcome collection, which is going to gather individuals who were part of the challenge studies from 2021, large funders like the Wellcome Trust and organizations like CEPI that coordinate vaccines for global populations. And we have an amazing lineup of speakers who are going to be all part of answering the question, what does the future for challenge studies look like? And we're opening this event to the public because we really want this to be something that public also feeds into, and as far as like the consultations are concerned. So if you are in London, you should definitely come, and obviously the drinks and canapes are on us. Not that that should be the incentive, obviously. And the last bit I'll put here is, challenge studies are not a new concept and being utilized to solve a lot of disease problems around the world, such as TB, malaria. And if you're looking to kind of delve more into this, we'll also build like a huge database of every challenge study that's been done or is being done right now around the world, so you can have a look at that. And if you kind of want to recap any parts of this talk about the significance and past of challenge studies, I'll also put a link to summarize that. But thank you so much for listening. Happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for the fantastic talk. I personally was super excited by the detailed explanation on how human challenge trial works and just clinical trials in general, and of course all the great work that One Day Sooner is doing. I'm super excited for this event here in April. We'll try to make it myself, but as I said earlier, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it into the swap card, and I will read it out for Jasmin to answer. There's no questions so far. Would love to know a little bit more about how challenging it is to recruit volunteers. How do you manage these volunteers? And I was also interested in hearing about the bottleneck about facilitating these volunteers and ensuring that they feel safe in doing such work and not infecting their family members.
Yeah, definitely. I think volunteer recruitment for clinical studies, even outside of challenge studies in generally, is super hard because you need a representative sample and you need a diverse sample, and the sample needs to be adjusted for the target population that you have for your solution. A lot of the organizations also utilize CROs, which are research contract agencies that will kind of do the hiring, recruitment of volunteers for you. And another reason why this is also time consuming is you have to do a lot of pre-screening as well. So if somebody signs up to be a volunteer, you can't just invite and infect them. You have to make sure that they are in their best health condition. If they have any pre-existing health medical conditions that might make them ineligible for the study. So the recruitment part itself is super expensive and time consuming. That's why phase 3 just costs so much. But I think something that we're really pushing for right now is this ability to make sure that the recruitment and challenge studies are super, super diverse and are representative for ethnic minority populations as well, which has always been a afterthought, which is just unacceptable moving forward. I work with one of my colleagues who I find really inspiring. He always says this is usually when we think about doing vaccine trials or challenge studies in places like Africa, they're always shown as sort of victims of medical machinery, given the dark past of how these studies came to be. But people living in those populations have just as much moral agency as anyone else on the planet to make their own decision about their contribution to advanced science. So really we should give them that opportunity and authority to participate. So really thinking about how to improve outreach to populations like that and make them more representative in clinical trials in general.
Thank you, that's a fantastic answer. Very thought-provoking. I'll talk to you more about it after. We do have another question here by Josh Blake. Many parts of challenge studies are current to real-world infection events. For example, healthy volunteers, delivery method of virus, and quantity of infectious dose. How much of a problem does this cause for generalizing the study results to the wider pandemic?
Right. So is Josh in?
They're different to like what's going on in the real world. Like you've got young healthy people.
Yeah.
Like I think they were like dropping it into their nose or something in COVID studies.
Yeah.
Stuff like this. Like, how concerned should we be that these are going to give us like different results?
Yeah, that's a good point to raise. I think like I don't see challenge studies like replacing clinical trials. I think they are very important in their own right, but I think that generalization is definitely a challenge because you are usually working with like more healthy populations that you're choosing for your sample, and often those are people in between ages of 18 to 29. But I think if we look at not having those conditions, which means that people who might have moderate health conditions or people who are not so healthy or in later stages of life, I think it really increases the amount of risks that might expose to these participants, which is like not something that is acceptable because patient safety is a priority. I think if we think about outside of challenge studies and how clinical trials are usually done, they also have the same issue of generalization. But I think there's ways we're improving that. That's why like collecting a lot of data points from different methodologies so we can also simulate a lot of these conditions is becoming more useful and imperative as we move forward. And I think that's why I was mentioning like this need to make sure that we have a bigger push for recruiting more diverse participants is really important as well. And I think like outside of challenge studies, that's something that the wider clinical teams are thinking anyway around the world. Yeah, does that help answer your question? Great.
Awesome. Does anyone have any other questions to ask? If you don't feel like typing it out, feel free to ask it with this mic, I think. We have enough time for a couple more questions.
I can just yell it if that's, yeah. I was just thinking about diversity with trials as well in terms of people who are pregnant and also neurodivergent people seem to be like usually underrepresented in these things, but also there are ethical complications involving them in the trials. Is there anything that One Day Sooner is like looking into in that space as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think we explored that for like some obvious reasons. I think, there's a lot of like ethical issues, and I think like one thing that we also have to be careful of, because you know a lot of these things we're pushing for sometimes have a lot of these like ethical barriers surrounding them, which sometimes when you give them as like a paper on a plate to policymakers, they freak out because they're like, oh my God, so what's someone gonna say? I said yes to infecting people with this pathogen. What we're trying to push for is like, instead of just accepting things at face value, these policymakers are actually willing to at least open the conversation. It's like, okay, let's forget about what it looks like on the outside. Let's actually investigate what are the cost-benefit ratios, like what does the process actually involve. And I think with maybe more on that note, with maybe populations might be pregnant or neurodivergent, I think that might really push the risk profile a bit too high and might risk just completely disengaging this entire conversation. But I think that's a really good point to make. Not something I had thought of before, but I will take that. Thank you for raising that.
Great question.
How do we test vaccines that are supposed to have like long-term effects, like the tetanus vaccine is supposed to protect us a few years, and I guess you can keep someone in the lab for a couple of years?
Yeah, unfortunately, no. No, so that's what I was mentioning, like in phase 4, once a vaccine is out on the market, it is still being continually monitored for different reasons. One reason is that the IP needs to be reviewed by pharma companies every couple of years, so they need to keep this in track, they need to be up to date about what new molecular compounds are being added to the vaccine. And you could do a phase 3 with 30,000 people, but once you release it out in the wild to billions in the population, some like very rare side effects might come out that you just had previously never seen. So once a vaccine is out on the market, there are legit like teams and pharma companies who it's like responsible for continually monitoring that over the life cycle of the vaccine. And there have been cases where some vaccines were out in the market but then decided to be pulled because turns out their efficacy was much lower in the wild population, hence that difficulty with generalization. And sometimes they had like side effects which seem unacceptable as well. So it's something that you do in real time once it's out there.
I was really hoping the answer to that question was, or so you think. But any other questions?
So I was really interested in, someone raised the point about ethics and how you get consent and everything. I was interested in looking in the advocacy part, like how do you work with political stakeholders? Because I was recently working at the House of Commons, so there are some MPs and there's cross-party support for these clinical trials, but then how do you get them on board, like, when ethics is concerned?
Yeah, I think like hoping that every one of them would listen to us and will be on board is like very like false expectation to hold. Even if we try our best, that's never going to be the case. But that's okay because we don't need everybody to be on board. We just need the right people to be on board. And I think like advocacy is an art. That's like, I keep figuring that out every day. And I think there's lots of parts involved. Right now, the way our advocacy is positioned or what my time is spent on is really trying to get time with a lot of people who are either directly accountable, responsible for making decisions for what does UK's biosecurity framework looks like when it comes to making vaccines and clinical trials, and making sure that they have engaged with these models, they understand what their potential can be, and helping like answer a lot of the questions they might have. Something that's really effective for advocacy purposes is a lot of these departments and agencies we're trying to talk to are like super time constrained and just like overwhelmed with like very limited funding. So I think it's important to understand they're also like just humans with 24 hours in their day, so can we make this easier for them in some manner? So a lot of these papers and things we're putting out, we're also like facilitating there with very like digestible sort of 1 or 2 pager summaries, just kind of gets to the point of like, this is what we're trying to say, this is what it achieved, this is how you can do it, and help coordinate that from them if they are interested to mobilize. But I think each department has its own culture or set of rules for how it prefers to be engaged, and I think another thing to highlight here is this sort of fight against time, in the sense that conversations about pandemic preparedness are definitely harder to engage now as we're sort of emerging outside of a pandemic, well, at least for first world countries. So it's important that we get their attention and it doesn't drift away as we're still trying to make this happen. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much. We have time for one last question. Does anyone have any final questions to ask? If not, I have one final question, you guys. I think you, like in your answer just now, you're talking about how advocacy is an art. I'm really curious to know a little bit more about how you balance sort of like the interest of pharmaceutical companies and profits versus like the interest of like, trying to safely protect your like volunteers who are signing up for human challenge trials, and like I imagine there's many different interests you're sort of balancing here, including the government. So.
Yeah. Oh gosh. Okay, I think like our priority is and always absolutely will be the participants that we represent. So we always will put them first to some extent. But I think like I think like sometimes pharmaceutical companies are always painted in a bad light just because it's like big pharma and private corporations. But I think it's important to appreciate that they do a lot of good work. Like the malaria vaccine, the amount of work that pharma companies did for that is really paramount. So I think like rather than approaching this from sort of an angle that, the bad pharma, we need to lobby them to do this, it's more of a collaborative approach we're trying to take, because the solution will not happen until all parties are on board. So it's giving them like the equity to make that decision, but also guiding them in the right direction. But yeah, I think I find that as a more sort of interesting and positive approach. And I think like maybe having a background in sort of advocacy, pharma, and then research, it's helpful for me because I've been on all sides. So I can kind of like bring that mindset to those meetings, which is helpful. But yeah, that's how I frame it.
Yeah, I think you have a really good and unique fit for this. So thank you for doing this, and thank you for your very insightful talk. Can we have another round of applause?
Thank you so much.